Thomas Lane's attorney kind of come rushing in.
Did you see the three defendants themselves?
No, they have been kept under heavy security, and they actually have been entering this building, we believe, through the back entrance, which is a heavily secured entrance that is usually used for people who are in custody. They are not in custody. A lot of concern here about safety and security, and actually this entire building is surrounded by a wire mesh wall that looks like it's about 14 feet high.
Yeah, and if I remember right, that's the only case in the entire courthouse right now is the trial of these three
Absolutely.
men. Yeah.
Well, the clerk's office isn't even open. Everything is shut down except for this trial.
What is the sense there? I imagine that were people surprised when they heard how quickly they came down with this verdict?
Well, I think when we got to 3:30 or so, they thought, well, they're probably going to take, a while longer. And then also people thought it would be longer just because of the number of counts and the number of defendants, and also the complexity of the wording. There was a lot of emphasis in the wording. It's actually in the charges that they have to be proven willfully that they did this, that they willfully chose to withhold medical aid. That means they knew it was against the law to withhold medical aid, but they did it anyway. That's what the prosecution had to prove. And that seemed like a tough burden to a lot of people. It just seemed like also one that might be a little complicated. These charges, I'm told by Joe Tamburino, are relatively unusual, and that the wording is difficult and was expected to take the jury quite a bit of time to get through.
Well, yeah, or it did or it didn't. I printed the instructions today, and I used old man print, so it's a little bigger, but I still have, 39 pages of the judge's instructions, word for word, and you see a lot of that talk about willful and what they did and what's accepted. So, I had to read a couple paragraphs over because I thought they were complicated, Esme.
You and me both, and certainly attorneys as well. This is very nuanced language, but obviously the jury felt very confident in this. She also explained who's on this jury. 12 jurors, they are all white. Most of them are from outstate Minnesota. They're in places like Nicollet County, even Jackson County. Rural areas, many of them. They are not from the metro. Remember, this is a federal trial, so the jurors are chosen from all over the state. They are all white. Most of them appear to be in their late 30s, 40s, 50s, and maybe even a little older. I'm sure there's probably a few younger people, but it's a very different jury than was called in the Derek Chauvin case, which was half people of color, half white people, and all from the metro area.
Yeah, and not sequestered. And usually when you sequester them, things tend to speed up. People get tired of sitting in hotel rooms and being away from their family.
Absolutely. This is the fifth week of this trial, although, and we don't know who was chosen to be in a hotel. They were offered hotel rooms. Jackson County is at least 2.5 hours away from here. I don't see how anybody could possibly do that commute back and forth in a day. I just think that would be too exhausting, and listen to all this testimony. So I think some of the jurors probably have been staying in hotels, but we were told that that was an option for them, but we just don't know exactly how many are staying in hotels.
And Esme, how many alternate jurors were used again? Because weren't there a couple of the jurors who, one was ill and one had a family emergency?
Yes, there were 6 alternate jurors. 4 ended up being dismissed during the course of the trial. And then we had 2 that were dismissed just, during jury instructions, which were just yesterday. They were dismissed. It was just whittled down to 12 yesterday. Again, this is really fast. This is very much like the Derek Chauvin verdict coming in, on the day after the jury instructions. Same thing happened in the state case of Derek Chauvin.
Yeah, I just want to note, if folks are just tuning in, obviously you can read the bottom of the screen. Esme's live at the federal courthouse in St. Paul. Amelia and I are here. We've got crews all over. We're going to go to Jen Merrily and Joe Tamburino in a minute. But if you're just tuning in, we're waiting for the verdict in the case of the 3 former officers accused of violating George Floyd's civil rights. We were notified about 10 minutes ago that the verdict was in, and we're just waiting for that to come down. And as soon as that happens, we will share it with you immediately. There are 5 different charges, 4 against 2 of the officers, 1 against 1. It's a little bit complicated. They're not all charged with exactly the same thing.
Of course, and we have to remember, too, that this actual trial, this federal trial, was supposed to take place last August, and it got postponed to January and moved into here. And went relatively quickly considering all the witnesses and, testimony.
Yeah, it was involved. Jen Merrily standing by as well. Jen, I know you were in the courtroom and reporting from St. Paul for several days as well while this was going on.
Yeah, the setup is interesting. There's the courtroom where people are, and there's some journalists every day that are selected to be in there. Esme Murphy was in there a number of days. And the days that she was in the courtroom, I was in another room called the overflow room, where other journalists are watching the proceedings on a big screen. So we're able to see what's going on. But those reporters that are in the courtroom are able to see kind of the nuances, what's going on, be able to look at the jury and see other things. So I was in that overflow room those days that Esme Murphy was in the courtroom. And what we can tell you now is Esme spoke a little bit about that jury. That jury is comprised of 8 women and 4 men. There were 2 alternates who were kept on call during this time while the jury was deliberating. As she mentioned, many of them are from out of state, Minnesota. We know that opening statements started January 24th, so about a month ago till we got to this point with the verdict. Closing arguments Tuesday. The jury began deliberating yesterday, deliberated all day, then came into today. About 13 to 14 hours total between yesterday and today until we got the notice that there was a verdict. Now, you mentioned a number of different charges against each of the defendants. Tou Thao and J. Alexander King both charged on 2 counts, Thomas Lane on 1. And each of the defense attorneys, there's a different defense attorney for each of the defendants, and had a little bit of a different take on why they said their client should be found not guilty. They did have some similarities in their defense, that they were poorly trained by Minneapolis police, that some of their training showed a restraint on a neck, that they did not know how serious George Floyd's condition was until after the ambulance left, that they did not know in the moment what happened, what was going on. Now, Tou Thao, his defense attorney, asked him questions when he was on the stand about his job, and he said his job was crowd control. Again, that he didn't know how serious it was until after the ambulance left, that when the ambulance arrived, they weren't rushing, and so he thought George Floyd was fine, and later learned how things had progressed. J. Alexander King said that the officer in charge of a scene is the senior officer. In that case, it was Derek Chauvin, who was 19 years on the job, that he had been trained by him during part of his training before he became a police officer who could be on the street alone. He also said that on the medical, that the person in a medical situation, the person who is at the head is the person in charge. And again, that was Derek Chauvin in this case. Thomas Lane testified that he asked twice to turn George Floyd over, that he went into the ambulance after they came to, he said he thought that medics might need some help. Again, saying that he didn't realize until later that what was actually going on. Now, the prosecution, obviously, a very different take on this, that the former officer should have known that there was a problem, that bystander pleas would have told them that something serious was going on, and to have listened to George Floyd's cries for help on the day that he died, and that the defendants stood by and did nothing, causing George Floyd's death. A lot to break down here. Those are some of what the prosecution and the defense cases were. Again, that's what the jury listened to for about a month. And soon we will find out what their verdict is. Yeah, Jen, thanks for all the breakdown and insight. We are awaiting the verdict for the George Floyd civil rights case against 3 former Minneapolis officers. As soon as that happens, we will get it to you immediately.
But for now, we're going to check in with criminal defense attorney Joe Tamburino, who is not affiliated with this case. Joe, what is your take on this, that they came up with a verdict so quickly, really?
Hi, Amelia. Hi, Frank. I would be worried if I was the prosecution, and here's why. You have 39 pages of jury instructions. You have 5 separate crimes to decide. You have 3 defendants. You have 4 weeks, a little over 4 weeks of testimony, opening statements, closing arguments, and to really wrap this up within 14 hours of deliberation, and it's a non-sequestered jury. That's very fast, which means that this jury must have decided the case pretty easily. So if I were the government, I'd be a little worried.
We're just getting some word right now about the verdicts.
Yeah,
Joe.
Your conventional wisdom might not be correct in this case. Let's go ahead and we'll fill people in on what we know.
This is what we're hearing, Joe. We're hearing that Tou Thao and J. Alexander King are found guilty of those 2 counts against them.
So Tou Thao guilty of failing to intervene against Derek Chauvin, and Tou Thao guilty of depriving George Floyd of medical care, and J. Alexander Kueng, the rookie, failure to intervene against Derek Chauvin, guilty of depriving Floyd of medical care.
We haven't heard about Thomas Lane quite yet.
So Joe, if those are 4 guilty counts, they took these 39 pages of jury instructions and all that evidence, and it didn't take them long to come to a decision.
It didn't. I'm surprised. They must have very much been convinced as to the guilt of those 2 individuals, because this is really fast. I mean, less than 2 days, basically. I'm surprised.
Joe, can you talk a little bit about, I know that you said, and Esme talked about it a bit too, that you said that the language is willfully is unusual.
Yes.
Okay, now we're just getting word
Yes,
right now. Our
because
producer is
willfully-
telling us that Thomas Lane also found guilty of the charges against him.
And that was only one charge, and that was depriving Floyd of medical care. So in total, 5 charges against 3 officers, and all 5 charges guilty against all 3 officers. So guilty, 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 all across the board, Joe, and done quickly.
Very quickly. I'm definitely surprised. You're right about the conventional wisdom. Definitely surprised. Do you know how they answered the jury verdict form? Because they had to answer yes or no as to whether or not the conduct, failing to intervene, caused or contributed to Mr. Floyd's death.
We don't, but Esme's standing by, and maybe we can go
And she can
ahead
fill
and
us in on
get
that.
that right now from here. So stay tuned, will you, Joe, because we want to come back to you.
Yes.
Let's go to Esme Murphy. Esme, are you there?
Well, a sweeping win for the prosecution here. All 3 of these defendants found guilty on all counts. And the answer to Joe Tamburino's question is that the answer was yes. In every single count, the jury found, for every single defendant, they found that yes, that deprivation of rights contributed to George Floyd's death. What that means is that the sentences here will be much stiffer because they led to George Floyd's death. They could have said that it did not lead to George Floyd's death, when it should have been a much lesser sentence. But this is a sweeping statement against, police actions and the requirement that all police need to be accountable, not only for their own actions, but for the actions of others. I mean, I think this trial really is going to go down really as a landmark in saying that. And there were a lot of people who really wondered, would the 2 rookies, 3rd and 4th day on the job, J. Alexander Kueng and Thomas Lane, would they get convicted of this? What would anybody have done on their 3rd or 4th day of the job, being told what to do by a 19-year veteran in Derek Chauvin? So this is quite the verdict, and I think a lot of people will find it stunning and surprising. And again, the jury makeup. This is an all-white jury from very conservative areas of the state of Minnesota, but they sent a message here. They said basically, police officers have a job and they have a duty to make sure that all of us are safe when they are in their care, that if you are arrested, you are in their care and you are responsible for them. And that message is loud and clear from this jury. But the answer to Joe's question about all the questions, did this contribute to George Floyd's death? The answer was yes on every count for every defendant.
And Esme, were the defendants in the courtroom, and did you see a reaction from them, or did they have a reaction at all if they were there?
I was down here in the courtroom. I've not seen any reaction. I have to imagine this is going to be a surprise, because I think that there was sort of a widespread belief amongst many reporters, some observers, that the case, especially against Thomas Lane, who asked twice if George Floyd could be rolled over, who did chest compressions on Floyd when he was in the ambulance, when, of course, it was way too late, that there might be a chance that he would be acquitted. He was not. And his actions were also found to be responsible for the death. And again, basically, I think this is a rewriting of what the police have to do and are required to do. That if you see somebody, it's not what these officers did, it's what they didn't do. They were convicted of what they didn't do. Derek Chauvin was convicted on state trial of what he did do. And that's a big difference. And I think that the jury has said it's their responsibility to make sure everything comes out all right. Really quite a statement here from this jury.
Esme, you were talking about the fact that this is kind of a surprising, does part of that go back? I mean, some of the talk I heard was, we saw part of the trial was almost like a condemnation of the Minneapolis Police Department's training procedures. You would see all these videos of officers holding people down, knees on necks. This kind of paramilitary almost organization where you listen to the older senior officers. In a way, and then I think we thought might put some doubt in people's mind, but obviously the jury looked past that, and I wonder if it's just a condemnation of that whole method and concept of training and what officers need to do moving forward.
Yeah. I don't think there was any question, Frank, you're right, that the training of the Minneapolis Police Department was on trial here. And there were big holes in that training. There's no question about that. But again, I think it came down to the videos, which were played a lot less here in this trial than they were played in the Derek Chauvin state trial. And when the first video was played in court, again, it had been 6 months since I had seen it, or 8 months since I had seen it. It's still as wrenching. It's still as difficult to watch the close-up of a man losing his life and saying repeatedly, I need help, 27 times, help me, I can't breathe. That is pretty chilling stuff, and it's not clear if these jurors had seen the video before, but we know from the Chauvin jury that many of the jurors had not seen very much of these videos at all. And I think it goes back to those videos. You see a man dying who didn't have to die. And over again, they said in the first 6 minutes that Derek Chauvin had his knee on George Floyd's neck when George Floyd was conscious, for 6 minutes, all they had to do was to turn George Floyd on his side. They didn't have to do CPR, didn't have to do anything. They could have just moved him on his side, because apparently when you are lying on the ground, handcuffed with your hands across your back, it is a risk of asphyxia. So that was all they could have done. They could have just turned him over, and that would have spared his life for those first 6 minutes. Then after the first 6 minutes, when he lost consciousness, then if they had just done CPR, there was a very good likelihood that they could have revived him. But by the time they did do CPR in that ambulance, it was too late.
Esme, we're going to go to Joe Tamburino for some context, but really quickly, do you know, have they been remanded into federal custody right after the verdict was read, or are they still out on bail? What happened?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I will tell you, in most cases, they would. In most cases, they would go directly into custody, convicted of these. These are felonies. These are very serious. And the potential sentence here is life, because these actions, or these inactions, the failure to intervene, the failure to provide medical aid, resulted in the death of George Floyd. That's what this jury found. That's a potential life sentence, Frank. However, I don't think it will be a life sentence, and most observers don't think it's going to be a life sentence, because Derek Chauvin pled guilty in this case earlier this year, and it was 20 to 25 years. Mr. Gray, do you have any comments, sir? Okay, that was Earl Gray, the attorney for Thomas Lane. He is obviously not accompanied by his client. Mr. Gray obviously not happy with that verdict. I know that he really felt very strongly that this charge should not have even been brought against his client. But I would guess, in most people's cases, if it's the average person, they'd be going to prison or jail right now.
Okay, Esme, thanks. Stay tuned, please, or stand by.
We're going to go to Joe Tamburino once again. Joe, what do you think the sentencing will look like for these defendants?
Well, Esme is correct. Under the law, since death was a result of all of this activity, everything that they were found guilty of, you could get up to life in prison. Now, practically, Mr. Chauvin is getting between 20 and 24 years. He's the main actor. Obviously, we know that. So it would be highly unlikely that the judge would sentence these three to something along 20 to 24 years like Mr. Chauvin. So we would expect less than that. But technically, they could get the same as Mr. Chauvin.
Joe, I have a question. You know, obviously, we have a state trial coming up. In past cases, it seemed to me that the criminal trial would go first, and then they would have the civil trial, the federal trial after. How is this going to impact, this federal trial, going to impact the criminal trial, the state trial?
Well, two things. They could still have the trial, obviously, because there are separate charges. But second, practically, you would think some type of a deal would be worked out. Take a look at Mr. Chauvin. He was convicted in state court and then worked out a plea bargain in federal court. We would imagine that something along those lines could happen here, because to do two separate trials involving the same incident would be a little unique. So now that we have a conviction, and I would assume they'd be sentenced within the next few months, that somehow the state trial would be worked out.
And Joe, Esme couldn't see it, but are we assuming the three gentlemen we're looking at and the 5 guilty charges, are they in federal custody right now? I mean, that's usually what happens, right? You get found guilty and they take you away.
That is correct. The only time that doesn't happen is if it's a low-level felony. If it's some type of felony where the guidelines basically would call for a very low amount of jail, say less than 5 years. But in a case like this where you have 3 convictions and so quickly, yes, I would imagine all 3 are in custody right now.
What? I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask you about, just going back to the wording, because you had talked about it a little bit, that it was unusual that willfully, that word, it was an unusual charge or terminology?
That's correct. In this type of a case where you have criminal civil rights violations against former police officers, the standard is willfully, which is like specific intent. Think of it this way. You have states of mind such as negligence, which is when someone doesn't use proper care. Then you have intentionally, where someone intentionally does something. But then above that, you have specific intent. That means willfully, that you intended to effect something by your actions. It's a high standard. And that's one of the surprising things about this case, that within 14 hours, 39 pages, and all these weeks of trial, they decided pretty solidly.
So these defense arguments, then, I mean, they just didn't, they really didn't resonate with these 12 jurors. All the other video they saw, the training, the concept of the hierarchy of rank inside the police department, I mean, that didn't have a lot of meaning for them, obviously.
Obviously, it didn't. And specifically, Frank, you mentioned the training. There's even a specific instruction from the judge. It's later on in the 39 pages of the jury instructions that talks about how you can use training. And it specifically says that an officer might not follow training, but that doesn't mean he's guilty of violating constitutional law. So the jury in this case had to have been convinced that they went so far afield of training and did willfully intend to do their actions. So it's a solid verdict for the government.
We're waiting for a little bit. The U.S. Attorney is supposed to have some brief remarks following the verdict, so we are waiting for that.
I just got messaged by Esme. It says they were not taken into custody, Joe. So that's different, right?
Interesting. That is different. That's very interesting. So I would imagine they're still going to be on their bond or personal bond.
Right. And then, and who knows what the sentencing will look like. And that's right. That's where the judge has to, apply some law and wisdom to the charges they get. And we have different, I'd imagine the sentences for Tou and King would be different than Lane. They were found guilty of 2 felony charges. Lane was found guilty of 1. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And what will happen from here is they'll have to go through what's called the pre-sentence investigation part, where basically someone from probation, the U.S. Correctional Department, will go through all aspects of the case. We'll interview the defendants. We'll interview their family and friends. We'll get victim impact and make a recommendation to the judge before sentencing. So all that has to be done from now till the sentencing date.
So, Joe, clearly, Derek Chauvin's case had no bearing whatsoever, him pleading guilty to these civil charges, these federal charges, rather.
That's correct. And, remember, since he's been convicted in state court and he pled guilty in federal court, we thought at the beginning of the case might one side or another call Mr. Chauvin as a witness. Obviously, that didn't happen. But you're right. I mean, it really didn't have any effect on these cases.
Joe, when we well, the Chauvin case, his criminal trial isn't a good example, but we look at the Kim Potter trial, and now we look at this trial. Is there some shift in what people as what the public wants to see out of police forces? I mean, can we read some things into this when we look at the totality of this verdict, the speed of it, the fact it was a complicated trial? Are we seeing some changes going on that we might recognize 5 years or 10 years from now and look back and say, yeah, this is the moment it changed? Are we in that?
Yes, we are. That's clearly the case. I mean, think of it this way, even beyond Mr. Chauvin with Kim Potter, and now we have a federal jury. And as you all have pointed out, this is a jury comprised of people from all over the state. You have Jackson County, that's about 3.5 hours away. Olmsted County, the suburbs of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So you have a wide swath of the state, and all 12 people agreed on these verdicts. So I think you're quite right. We are in some type of a change where the public is expecting something much different than what we've had before from the police departments.
Well, let's go in a second. We're going to go to Jennifer Merrily. But, Joe, I just feel, I mean, obviously I'm biased. I want everything on TV and public. But I feel like the public gets cheated a little bit when we can't see what was happening, or at least have the right to see it. You know, we broadcast Potter gavel to gavel, and we broadcast Chauvin trial gavel to gavel. The federal court won't allow it, period.
That is correct. And that's unfortunate because I completely agree with you. TV gives us transparency and trust. You get to see how the sausage is made. You get to see everything that happens in that courtroom, which is very important so that the public could say this was a fair process. People on both sides got heard fairly. But unfortunately, the federal law is the federal law.
Well, maybe some change will come on that, too. Who knows? All right. Stick
Thanks,
close,
Joe.
will you, Joe?
Now let's check in with WCCO's Jennifer Merrily, again, who she's been covering this trial for us also. Jen?
Yeah, and I'm just getting a look at some of what we call the pool notes from this. And that's the reporters, the journalists who are actually inside the courtroom who can see what was happening and take notes about kind of what people were looking like when they saw this. And so I'm reading here that it looks like when Thomas Lane was found guilty, he drops something and kind of sits back. His attorney, Earl Gray, shakes his head. It says Lane's hands were folded in his lap, and he shakes his head as he looked at his attorney. So it kind of gives you an idea of what was happening inside the courtroom while the verdicts were being read. It looks like one of the jurors was crying as she gave, her what she thought. Another juror. Let's see, it looks like they looked around at the woman, and another woman in the courtroom was dabbing her eyes. As I'm just getting these in right now, these notes are just coming in. It says the judge thanked the jurors, and he wanted to visit with those jurors after the sentencing. The verdict. Of course, what comes next is sentencing, and we're learning now that the 3 defendants were not taken into custody, were released. I've made some inquiries about why that was the case today. It sounds like they will all be meeting with the probation office to get started on the pre-trial sentence investigation. And that's something that they would review with their attorneys before they would be called back to the court for sentencing. These are all notes that were taken by people who are in the courtroom, and this is kind of the notes that we're hearing about exactly what was happening and what people were looking like and feeling as these verdicts were read.
Yeah, so they leave court, they have to go meet with the probation officer, they'll work on this sentencing, and then at some point they'll go back and get sentenced, and then who knows, at some point then they'd go to a federal prison, and then maybe they get out of the federal prison and go to a state trial. That could be the possible order of what happens. Yeah,
they are still facing, at this point, that state trial in June. That is still to come at this point. We'll see if this federal verdict changes anything. But again, we're learning today that all 3 found guilty on all of the charges against them. We heard a lot in court about in your custody, in your care from the prosecution, and that's clearly something that spoke to this jury.
All right. Thank you, Jen. I'm sure we'll check in with you again. But right now, we're going to go back to Esme Murphy. Esme, are you there? Have you heard anything else?
Yes, I am, right here.
What are you hearing?
Yeah, well, I just think, people are a bit surprised by this verdict. But I will say, going back to a point that Frank made earlier when he asked Joe Tamburino, is this a fundamental shift? Are we at a critical turning point or a moment in history where people are looking at police differently? And I think the answer has to be yes. This is right up there with the Derek Chauvin case. Derek Chauvin case was pretty much a slam dunk. I mean, you saw those tapes. It was obvious what he did. If he hadn't been there, if that knee hadn't been on the neck, he would be alive. But what this jury did is said, if those people are officers and they're on the scene and they see something that is wrong and they know it's wrong, they are duty bound to intervene and they are duty bound to provide medical care. And I think you're going to see a reaction in the way policing is performed on the street as a result of this verdict. This is a huge deal and really, I think, a transformative moment for the police. Also, it's the fourth guilty verdict against a police officer in Minnesota in the past 5 years. That's extraordinary. You had the Mohammed Noor case, which was a black officer who shot and killed Justine Damon. You, of course, had the Kim Potter case. You had obviously this case, and you also had Derek Chauvin. But all of those resulting in convictions, I think, is a real statement about what kinds of expectations people have of a police department. And it's interesting, Jennifer saying in the notes that one of the jurors was crying. These folks are, there are sympathetic characters. Thomas Lane had volunteered he got the Community Service Award at the Police Academy for organizing groups of police cadets to go down to Mary's Place, a well-known homeless shelter in downtown Minneapolis, to help there. He had, volunteered in North Minneapolis with various youth groups. I mean, these people were, completely law-abiding. They have no record. And this is they're facing serious prison time.
Yeah, this was more about, the Derek Chauvin case was about what he did, and this was what they didn't do in terms of helping out, like you said.
Right.
And Esme, let's go back to the jurors real quickly, though. So yesterday, a judge did seal their identities, right? And it can't be opened for 10 years, I think it was, did you say?
An extraordinary 10 years. This judge is 84 years old. He's been on the bench. He was appointed by President Reagan, and he does his things his way. The jurors' names in the Chauvin state case were sealed as well, but they became unsealed after about 6 months or 7 months. These apparently are going to be sealed for 10 years. We'll see where we're all going to be in 10 years, but that seems like an awfully long time to have something of such public interest be kept from the public.
Yeah, it certainly preserves their identity. I'd imagine that probably gives them some peace that you and me, Amelia, Jen Merrily, can't go banging on their door and ask them what they were thinking. Esme, back to the other point you were making. I think you're right, and that's why I was trying to pose the question, because you wonder now how this affects training, how this affects any other officer, because part of human nature is, gosh, I'm starting off as a new reporter, and if Esme's doing some kind of behavior, she's been doing it for 30 years, I might mimic her or I might defer to her. But now, and that's a terrible analogy, but I think the point is made, is now that's not what's should be happening within any of these police departments, apparently.
And one of the things that was made, and they weren't able to really make this a point entirely, this case has already changed the way Minneapolis police recruits are trained. It's already changed the way recruits are trained all over the country. The duty to intervene is front and center. It's not just a line in a book as it was in their training manual. It is front and center. They have scenarios and act out scenarios. How would you intervene against a senior officer? It's already changed the training. It's already affected things, and I think it's going to affect things going forward. And this has got to be in the minds of every single officer who goes out on a call, that they are going to be looked at again, for not just for what they do, but for what they don't do. And that if they have somebody in their custody, that means that person is in their care and they are responsible for that person. And I can't say how loudly I think this message was sent by this jury.
Yeah, and quickly.
All right. Thank you, Esme. Obviously,
and quickly, yes.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot of reaction all around the world from this verdict here, but we're going to go to Jennifer Mearley right now because we're hearing from George Floyd's legal team, and they have reaction to what happened today.
Yes, Ben Crump, who is the attorney for George Floyd's family, along with other attorneys, has released a statement basically saying that this closes another chapter in the step of justice for George Floyd. And one thing that was interesting that I'm going to read from this statement, he said, today's guilty verdict should serve as the guiding example of why police departments across America should expand and prioritize instruction on an officer's duty to intervene and recognize when a fellow officer is using excessive force. And that's, a statement that kind of goes to the heart of what was talked about during this trial, and what Esme's been talking about is the duty to intervene and the training. It goes on to say that the existing policies were not on trial, but the human beings that were present when the breath was taken from an unarmed man right in front of them. He goes on to talk about that this will not bring George Floyd back to his loved ones, but they hope with the verdicts, quote, we hope that the ignorance and indifference towards human life shown by these officers will be erased from our nation's police departments so no other family has to experience a loss like this. Again, this is from Ben Crump and the other attorneys that are representing the family of George Floyd, talking today again about how this is a step in the finding justice for George Floyd, also talking about those training procedures and how this should serve as a warning, kind of a wake up for other departments across the country. Frank, Amelia.
Thanks for the update, Jen. We appreciate it.
We're going to go back now to Joe Tamburino, talk a little bit about that. Joe, what do you make of what Esme had said, that basically, and what you and Frank were saying a while ago, that this is a statement that things are changing?
Yes, absolutely they are. You can't help but notice it. And you have to think, what else has caused this change? And one of it is videos, because we live in a world where there are body-worn camera videos, store videos, security videos, street cams, cell phone videos. Everything nowadays is captured on video. And like you have pointed out, the videos with Mr. Floyd, obviously they have impact. So part of this change is also how everything nowadays is being recorded on videos.
Yeah, well, it's not just changes, Joe. I mean, but like, watershed stuff, right? I mean, if we're not seeing some of these things, you get into the old your word against my word, and usually the policeman's word is the best word, and that's, caused decades worth of angst and anxiety, especially within the black community, but with people in general, because it's you take the cop's word, and the video thing has changed everything, and will continue.
Yes, it will continue, because the videos are only going to be more available, because right now, pretty much everywhere in the metro area, police officers wear body-worn cameras. But that's not the case throughout the rest of Minnesota or the federal authorities. Will body-worn cameras be worn by FBI officials, Homeland Security? We have no idea, but they are becoming more and more common.
Yeah, and then again, you get in the issue where we saw all the riots in Uptown, where the federal agents were not wearing a body-worn camera, and a man is shot and killed, and apparently he had a gun, and apparently that gun was fired, if you want to believe all the ballistic stuff. But I think both sides would cry out and go, hey, we don't want weeks of riots. We want to see the video if he did, in fact, raise a gun and shoot at the officers, or let's have more riots because he didn't raise his gun and shoot at the officers. But, I guess it's kind of like, let's see it, right?
That's correct. You bring up a good point about when do we get to see the videos. More and more, these videos are being released earlier. And I would imagine that under state law with the Data Practices Act, there probably would be some changes in the future where they're going to release these videos earlier than they normally do. Because right now, under state law, data practices, these videos are part of what's called investigative material. And legally, they're not to be released till after the case is done or the investigation is closed. Now, chiefs of police have authority to release them early, and we've seen that. But you might see state law change where, regardless of the situation, the videos become public in a much quicker time period.
Yeah, well, we saw that with Amir Locke and the release of the video. Joe, stay close. Joe Tamburino, good to have you with us.
Yeah, we're going to just do a quick recap. Once again, the 3 former Minneapolis police officers who were charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights All three have been found guilty on all of their charges. Tou Thao failing to intervene against Derek Chauvin, depriving Floyd of medical care. That was another charge, guilty on both of those. J. Alexander King, his charges, failing to intervene against Derek Chauvin and depriving Floyd of medical care. And Thomas Lane, the charge against him, depriving Floyd of medical care.
What happens? Who's talking? The federal attorney?
The U.S. attorney is supposed to be speaking, having brief remarks shortly there at the federal courthouse. But we're going to go to Esme Murphy. She's there right now, and she may have a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, we are hearing that somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office will be making a statement. There actually isn't yet an official U.S. attorney, so there's an interim U.S. attorney at the U.S. Attorney's Office right now. I think one thing that's really interesting, and obviously the jury took this to heart, is the judge said, use your common sense, or the prosecution said, use your common sense. And they talked about common sense in the jury instructions. And one of the things that all three of these defendants said is they didn't know how badly George Floyd was, how dire, how life-threatening his condition was. And they went back to the videos and to that small crowd that was gathered there. And in that crowd, there were 4 teenagers, a 9-year-old, a 62-year-old man, somebody who was an expert in jiu-jitsu. I mean, it was kind of a combination of all kinds of people. And in that crowd, people were saying, he's not breathing. He stopped breathing. He's going to die. The calls out from that crowd, obviously using their own common sense to say this man is clearly passing away under your knee. And I think, again, we go back to the video and the video of these citizens on the street, these citizens of Minneapolis who spoke out, who recorded their truth. And this is the result, and I think it already has changed an awful lot.
Esme, that's so interesting because, what you said makes perfect sense, and it's so simple, right? I mean, we see what's going on. We're trying to tell the cops what's going on. Something really horrible and bad is going on here. But I think we get so wrapped up covering it into the legal jargon and to what the evidence was and what the...
Right.
But what you said really boils it down to the most simple level of there is something horrific taking place in front of me, and if I can see it and these kids can see it, why don't you see it? That's really interesting.
Right.
I didn't think of it in those terms.
Well, I think when you see, and it's actually been about 9 months since I had seen the videos, and they really are stomach churning. I mean, we've all seen them, and we've all seen too much of them, but they are still as raw and hard to look at now as they were the first time that I saw them or that many people have seen them. And I think that's it. I mean, that's it. Here was a man who was breathing, who was, yes, having some problems. It wasn't his best day in the world, but he was alive. And in the course of 9 minutes, he wasn't. He was killed. He was murdered. And we see that, and it's all on tape. And it's on tape from multiple angles. And some of those angles did capture these other officers. And obviously the jury didn't buy that explanation, that they didn't realize how badly George Floyd was ailing. And he did say, I can't breathe, 27 times. He asked for help and said he couldn't breathe.
It wasn't a 90-second event. It was a 9-minute event,
yes.
And that makes a difference, too. So, Esme, stay close. We want to hear more of what's happening there. Thank you.
We're going to go to Jen Merrily right now, who has a little bit more information about what was going inside the courtroom.
Well, yeah, let's talk about some of the reactions inside the courtroom, and then we have a new statement as well. So as we're getting some information about what the reactions were from inside the courtroom, I can now tell you that there was one person who appeared to be there for Tou Thao. It said he did not show any reaction when the judge read the guilty verdict in his case, but there was a woman who started to cry afterwards and was dabbing tears from behind her glasses. J. Alexander King and his attorney, Thomas Plunkett, showed no outward signs of emotion. That's what the Pool reporter is telling us, who was in the courtroom. And Thomas Lane and his attorney, Earl Gray, both apparently shook their heads and when his guilty verdict was read. The defendants were then escorted out of the courtroom by the U.S. Marshals with their attorneys into an elevator by themselves. We now know that they are out of custody and working on a pre-trial sentencing. what I can tell you now is that we've been getting a lot of reaction from the family of George Floyd's attorney, Ben Crump, and his team, to now the ACLU of Minnesota. This is from the interim executive director, who said the case highlights so many of the failures of our policing system. And part of the statement says, and quote, "This verdict shows that every police officer involved in police violence is responsible for its outcome. It was clear Mr. Floyd had stopped breathing or moving. He had no pulse. Any of these officers could have saved George Floyd's life. They had a duty to intervene, and they failed. They are all accountable for his death." And that is some of what this jury had to take into consideration during this trial, month-long trial, is what was their responsibility? What did they do? What did they not do? And again, we know that those three former officers, Tou Thao being found guilty on failing to intervene against Derek Chauvin, depriving Floyd of medical care. J. Alexander Kueng guilty on both of those counts as well. Thomas Lane guilty of depriving Floyd of medical care. These statements coming in very strong, saying that these officers should have known better. We heard definitely from the prosecution that in your custody is in your care, and that an officer has a duty to intervene when they see something that is going wrong. The jury siding with the prosecution in this, finding the three former officers guilty on all counts. Again, we heard from Ben Crump, and his team, which are the attorneys for George Floyd and his family, and their statement also strong, saying in part that it closes a chapter of this portion of trying to get justice for George Floyd, that he will not be brought back to his family, but this does say something. And it says that, again, that today's guilty verdict should serve as a guiding example of why police departments across America should expand and prioritize instruction on an officer's duty to intervene and recognize when a fellow officer is using excessive force. So a theme here talking about what the role is of officers when they are on a scene, what the role is when they see an officer doing something that they don't agree with. And again, those three former officers being found guilty today. Frank, Amelia.
Jen, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We're going to go to Joe Tamburino once again. Joe, I know that we talked about this earlier, but I'm sure there's people who are just joining us right now. Can you talk a little bit about how this is going to affect the state case? Because historically, it seems that the federal charges are brought when the state case has failed. This is sort of reversed. We have the federal case, and then we have a state case pending.
Yes, you're right, because initially we all thought the state case was going to go first, as usually is the case. But then the state continued their case into March, and the federal authorities brought the trial earlier, obviously starting in January. So here's what could happen. Since these three individuals have been convicted in federal court, we would imagine that they would try to work out their state charges. Why? Because it's what Mr. Chauvin did too. He was convicted in state court and then went to federal court and worked out a deal of 20 to 24 years, run concurrently. So we would have to assume that at some point in time, these three defendants will try to work out some type of deal with the state.
Joe, a different issue. We're recruiting police officers, aggressively. Actually, tonight there's a class that's going to graduate in St. Paul. So does the next class that goes into St. Paul or Winona, or more importantly, Minneapolis, is their training going to be different, literally based on what happened today? Should it be different? I mean, there's a lot of issues here about how you're actually training folks, because obviously you don't want the training that Lane and King got, because in their training, you think they're actually following the rules if you listen to the testimony and even some of their trainers. Although, granted, the trainers say, they should have done something, but it just seems so contradictory. I would have to think there's got to be a new clear path moving forward.
That's a great point, because, think about this. Not only MPD, but all law enforcement agencies in Minnesota are going to have to look at their training programs right now, because you're right. Every day we're going to have new police officers come online, whether it's through new cadet programs, people being sworn in or transferring from other departments, but that's going to have to be addressed immediately. And I would imagine it's going to be some type of debate over resources, because right now, look how MPD is strapped. I believe we have less than 600 actual officers when we're supposed to have 888, and with the budgets. So, I mean, they are really going to have to react quickly, and I'm sure it'll be a matter of resources.
Should it happen at the municipal level, or should the state, and again, we've had problems at the state, trying to get on the same page, but should there be a state governing thing that says whether you're state patrol or an officer in Duluth or an officer in Litchfield, you need to follow these rules, or is that just too hard to do? I mean, I'm just kind of thinking out loud if that helps us or if that hurts us, if it should be done locality by locality.
State law needs to catch up with all this training. It's hard to do it by each locality. Yes, the municipalities will do it first. Why? Because they're smaller and they're able to react more quickly. But at the state level, and this could take some time, I would imagine you're also going to see some laws and rule changes. Because you're right, you can have different types of training programs depending upon whether you're in St. Louis County or Jackson County or Ramsey County. It should be similar.
Do you think that these verdicts will help that along with the state? Because I know the state, they've been trying to change them, but it's always been defeated, and moving forward, this has to some way impact that, don't you think?
I would think so, especially since you want to start getting ahead of this. It's always more difficult to play catch up for any type of agency, let alone a police agency. So it would be good to get ahead of this. Additionally, we could see something on a federal level, because obviously there's a lot of attention being paid across the nation as to what's going on. I think what we're having right now is a trial involving the Breonna Taylor case down in Tennessee. One of the officers is on trial right now. So we're seeing more and more of this.
I wonder if, too, we get into the medical part of it. We heard this term excited delirium a lot. The ACLU in Minnesota came out and said, hopefully this debunks the theory of excited delirium for police to justify their acts. That being said, I listened to an hour program over the weekend about the man who came up with the term excited delirium, and he absolutely, this doctor stands by it, Joe. He says the problem is, it's not that excited delirium doesn't exist, this condition where people are high on drugs or whatever and have a lot of strength and are very difficult to control. He said the problem is the abuse of the term excited delirium. He said it's just become too much of a blanket for everyone to use, but he firmly stands by the fact that it exists. But I think that use of ketamine, all these issues related to public safety, right?
Absolutely, you're correct. And, think about that, how things could get so politicized even when it comes to medicine. And really, we have to get beyond all of that. The excited delirium issue has become a red-hot button issue. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, it is something that police officers have been trained on. So when you have an officer who is trained on something, even if later on it's debunked, it's hard to get past that.
Yeah. Like you need untraining almost, or revision. So, all right, stay close, will you, Joe?
Thank you, Joe. And as you can see here, we are waiting for somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're supposed to come out and give brief remarks about the verdict. For now, we're going to go out to Aaron Hassanzadeh, who is outside. And Aaron, is there anybody out there? I know in former trials, there have been crowds gathering, whether for or against the verdict. Are you there, Aaron?
Oh, apparently
not. Well, we
not.
can see her, but I don't think she can hear us.
Where is she? I don't see her.
I think.
Oh, I see where she's at there. Maybe we'll see if we can get someone to cue her. If not, what people are looking at right now is, the odd thing is there is no U.S. attorney
yes.
in this district, the federal district here for Minnesota. There was some talk of some nomination of Andy Lugar coming back to do it. He used to do it before, and then there was a lot of politics around that. So we expect someone from the office of the U.S. Attorney to go ahead and speak. We're not sure who that person's going to go ahead and be. Esme's not far from there. Aaron's outside. And
I think we're going to go to Esme now because
but
she
I think
can hear us.
I think that why don't you ask Esme your question that you're going to ask Aaron?
Well, I don't know. Esme, I don't know if you can see outside or not, but usually on these kind of trials, we have a group gathering outside, citizens coming over. Have you seen anybody show up at the courthouse?
You know, they didn't make this place very protest-friendly, Amelia. I can tell you, this entire building has a mesh fence around it, or mesh, wall around it. There's also no parking. Streets are blocked off. It's very hard to get to. Obviously, it's also been really cold. Every day when I came here, I'd see maybe 1 or 2 protesters. People, though, of course, were monitoring this. And I think it's also different when it's not on television, I think, but they were still following it. So I'm sure people are just immensely relieved, those people who were concerned about police actions. But no, I do not see anybody outside, and I would think most of them would be out there. This is the front back here. On this other side is the back where those 3 now convicted former officers were taken out for their own security. Security here is very, very tight for this trial, and really there has not been an incident here at all that we've been aware of.
Yeah, and well, that's all by design. I mean, the big high fences, the traffic, I mean, it was designed to not be inviting and keep people away.
Right, and they were very concerned. And, there was actually a push by the St. Paul Police Department to have it moved to Minneapolis because the Minneapolis Federal Courthouse is more secure. It's a more modern building. But we are going to have Charles Kovats, who is the acting or interim U.S. attorney, make some statements. Obviously, this is an incredible vindication for them. The judge actually, during the course of the trial, was pretty hard on the prosecution. The prosecution kept trying to hammer home some of the same points. Obviously, that worked because the jury listened to them. But it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say. And it'll be interesting to hear also from Attorney General Keith Ellison about the status of that state trial going forward in June. It would be very much so the same sort of evidence. It would be different charges, aiding and abetting murder. But these folks here, these 3 men, are facing some very tough sentences on these charges. So it's not clear if that trial is going to go forward or be necessary. I'm sure the Attorney General will have a comment on that. He obviously has been very successful in the prosecutions that he has led, with the successful prosecution of Derek Chauvin and the successful prosecution of Kim Potter.
Right. Esme Murphy, live at the federal courthouse in St. Paul. Thank you. Stand by, please.
We're going to go out to Aaron Hassanzadeh, who is outside of the courthouse. There, Aaron, what are you seeing or hearing out there?
Looks quiet.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amelia, it is quiet. I mean, it's basically just us and then other outlets, as you can see, lined up here. We're on the back side of the courthouse where some vehicles have been leaving. We know that the 3 ex-officers will be released on bond. So that seems to be the shot that people are sort of waiting for. Will we get that shot of them driving out here? And then as we walk around the corner, we're showing you we've got a single person out here holding her sign. Photographers taking pictures because it's a 1-person crowd for now on the back side of this courthouse. And so pretty quiet, understandably. The weather is a little bit tough. Traffic is moving really slow. So it could be that people are making their way here and it just takes a while, I can tell you myself. I wonder if we can check in with you here. Hi there. Can you? Okay. All right. And there's a lot of pressure when you're the only person out here, but it's possible there could be more. We'll keep an eye on it. Really, it feels like crews are waiting around the back here of the courthouse to see if the 3 ex-officers who were just found guilty will be heading out here and if people will be able to see them when they leave. We don't know the logistics there, but you can imagine there's probably a couple more people headed this way. And so we'll certainly keep an eye on it. We might want to make our way to other sides of the building too. It's cold. It's snowy out here, but we know that hasn't stopped people in the past. And so it could just be that it's a little slow going to get here to the courthouse. But so far, you see it there, 1 sign.
Yes, very unusual and different than what we've
now.
seen at other trials. Aaron Hassanzadeh live in St. Paul. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining our breaking news coverage, everyone. We appreciate it. We want to actually now jump in and start with our 5 p.m. news. So if you're just joining us, you're jumping right into live continuing coverage of the guilty verdicts in the federal trial of 3 former Minneapolis police officers. We can let you know that there were 5 charges against those 3 officers, Tou Thao, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane, and we have the results.
Yes, and those 3 were found guilty of all 5 charges. Tou Thao had 2 charges against him. Just like J. Alexander King, their charges were failing to intervene against Derek Chauvin, depriving Floyd of medical care. Both of them found guilty of both of those charges, Tou Thao and J. Alexander Kueng. Thomas Lane had one charge against him, depriving George Floyd of medical care. He was found guilty on that charge.
Esme Murphy was at the courthouse in St. Paul when the verdict was read. Let's go to her live now. Esme, this is a big deal for several reasons. Why don't you take a minute, 2 minutes, and explain to folks some of the significance of what happened today?
Sure. Well, this is a stunning victory for the prosecution and a strong statement about how policing should happen and what police should do on the job. These three officers were on trial for what they did not do. They did not intervene against Derek Chauvin. They did not provide medical aid. Derek Chauvin, on the other hand, was on trial for what he did do. And this was considered the harder hill to climb in terms of a prosecution. There were a lot of questions if this prosecution would succeed, and it did. And not only were they found guilty on every single count, even the one that was only facing one count, even Officer Lane, former Officer Lane, who asked twice if George Floyd could be rolled over, the jury found in each count that the deprivation of those rights did contribute to George Floyd's death. They were asked a yes or no question. Did that deprivation of rights contribute to George Floyd's arrest or result in George Floyd's death? And they answered yes each time. That's going to mean a tougher sentence. But again, a sweeping statement by a jury, an all-white jury from really all over the state of Minnesota, most of them definitely way outside the metro, very few metro folks, mostly middle-aged, who obviously said this is not the kind of policing that we want to see. And if you are a police officer and you have somebody in custody, they are in your care, and they should have survived, and George Floyd should have survived.
Yeah, quite a day. Esme, thank you very much. Stay tuned. We'll check in with you in a minute. The next thing that's going to happen, folks, is we're expecting Charles Kovacs from the U.S. Attorney's Office to go ahead and give some comments here live. And when that happens, we'll take you to it.
Right now, we're going to go to Joe Tamburino. Joe, we're going to talk about the sentencing process here and what we can expect in terms of their penalties. You heard Esme talking and saying that the jurors did say that, yes, that their inaction did contribute to George Floyd's death, so really they could get a tougher sentence.
That's absolutely true, because that's the important part in terms of the sentencing. Did their actions or inactions, what they failed to do, contribute to Mr. Floyd's death? Had the jury answered no to that, their sentences would be minimal, less than 5 years. But now that they've said yes, what they did, failure to intervene, caused or contributed to Mr. Floyd's death, the sentences could be up to life. Now, they're not going to get life, of course, but they could be 10, 15 years. We don't know.
All right, Joe. Thank you.
We're going to go right now to the acting U.S. Attorney. He has some statements. Charles Kovacs, who is with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and he's going to talk about the verdicts that happened just an hour ago.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charles Kovacs. I'm the acting United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, and I'm joined today by the prosecution team, Assistant United States Attorneys Alan Slaughter, Amanda Surdich, Leanne Bell, Evan Gilead, DOJ Trial Attorney Samantha Treppel, Trial Attorney Tara Allison, Paralegal Steph Braun, Henry Frank, Victim Witness Specialist Selena Colesrud, and Christina Bussi, and FBI Special Agent Blake Hostetter. I'm also here with FBI Special Agent in Charge Michael Paul. On behalf of the trial team, the United States Attorney's Office, and the Department of Justice, I want to thank the jury for their service over the past several weeks. May 25th, 2020 represents an inflection point in our community. On that day, a man tragically and senselessly lost his life at the hands of law enforcement. It was a scene that will forever be seared into our memories. George Floyd, handcuffed and pinned to the ground by 3 officers, while a 4th, Officer Tou Thao, stood nearby. Officers Lane and Kueng were positioned on Mr. Floyd's back and legs, and Officer Derek Chauvin held his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. He was held down for more than 9 minutes. Mr. Floyd called out more than 20 times that he couldn't breathe, repeatedly begging to be let up. Eventually, he stopped begging He stopped breathing. His pulse stopped. He lost consciousness. He became motionless. All the while, these officers chose to do nothing to assist Mr. Floyd as he lay dying. And the world collectively witnessed this tragic and horrifying loss of life and humanity. Today, former officers Tou, Kueng, and Lane stand convicted by a jury of their peers for willfully violating Mr. Floyd's civil rights, the same rights guaranteed to all of us by the United States Constitution. These officers had a moral responsibility, a legal obligation, and a duty to intervene. And by failing to do so, they committed a crime. This is a reminder that all sworn law enforcement officers, regardless of rank or seniority, individually and independently, have a duty to intervene and provide medical aid to those in their custody. It's a fundamental duty of policing. It's good policing. In their custody is in their care. And it's a duty followed every day by police officers in communities around the United States, often under very difficult circumstances. Officers Tou, Kueng, and Lane on that day failed to fulfill this duty, and as a result, George Floyd senselessly died. That is why they were charged. That is why they were convicted. And although today's verdict won't bring George Floyd back to his family or his friends, his community, and his loved ones, this outcome represents our collective affirmation to uphold George Floyd's civil rights, again, the same ones afforded to all of us under the Constitution. My pride for the work done by this team and by my office and the department as a whole is immense. This trial presented numerous challenges and hurdles, all of which this team met and surpassed with tenacity and determination and grace and grit. It was a distinct honor and privilege to try this case. Finally, and importantly, I want to thank the Floyd family and his loved ones for their patience and cooperation for the past 2 years. Their strength is admirable. I'm going to be followed here at the lectern by FBI Special Agent in Charge, Michael Paul. SAC Paul.
Thank you, Charlie. Again, my name is Michael Paul. I'm the Special Agent in Charge of the FBI's Minneapolis Field Office, which serves Minnesota and North and South Dakota. I want to start by echoing the comments of our acting U.S. Attorney and acknowledging the service of the prosecutive and investigative teams in this case. Their work from the very get-go on the tragic day that this began was prompt and swift. It was collaborative, not only between investigators and prosecutors, but also with our partners here in the state of Minnesota, and it established an important standard for us for swift investigative action in these types of matters. I also want to thank the work of the jury and their discerning ear, their diligence, and really their fortitude in bringing forth a very important verdict for our country. From the very beginning, the case had great potential to help inform an ongoing debate across our country about law enforcement. And today, their work, their diligence again, and their verdict helps us reaffirm a very important standard for all of law enforcement across America. The FBI takes very seriously our civil rights investigative responsibilities. It's one of the most unique investigative jurisdictions and one of the most important programs that we work. These cases are very important for defending the rights of our citizens, and it's important for us to remember the consequences of these types of incidents as we go forward. And this case, again, has established a very important benchmark for all law enforcement officers, agents, deputies at all levels of law enforcement across America. That we are responsible, we are professionally accountable for our actions and caring for those that are in our custody and protecting United States citizens, even those that have broken the law. So again, my great thanks and appreciation for all the portions of the justice system that worked collaboratively and in a timely manner on this case in order to make sure that justice was done. And the FBI remains committed in the future to work these types of matters with our partners. And we're so lucky and so proud to have the collaborative relationships that we have in the state of Minnesota to work on these matters when warranted. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'd like to invite Assistant United States Attorney Leanne Bell to come to the lectern and talk about the case from the trial team's perspective.
Good afternoon. My name is Leanne Bell. I'm an Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, and a proud one today. On behalf of the team, we want to say thank you to all of those who supported this prosecution. We haven't been able to talk about George Floyd much during this trial, but as one of the brave bystanders said, George Floyd was a human being. He deserved to be treated as such. He was a son, a father, a significant other, a family member, and a friend to so many. His family endured so much to get here. And we want to thank the Floyd family for their patience and cooperation during the course of this investigation and prosecution. My hope, the hope of our team, is that today's verdict will bring a measure of justice. We also want to say thank you to the jury for diligently listening to this trial and through it all, hearing his voice. This trial has been long and challenging for many reasons, but this jury carried out their civil service with attentiveness
earlier. He was the first one to speak, and he basically talked about how May 25th, 2020 represents an inflection point in our community, and on that day, a man tragically and senselessly lost his life to law enforcement. He went on to say, in their custody is in their care, and it's a duty followed every day by police officers in communities around the United States. Here he is again. I'll let him speak.
Would like to say a few words, and I'll start by introducing Felonious Floyd. Mr. Floyd.
How y'all doing? I'm Felonious Floyd, brother of George Floyd. And I have my nephew with me, Brandon Williams, who George raised like a son. Today is a good day for us. That this is the first time that I ever seen something like this did. 4 white officers were convicted of killing an African-American man. I know a lot of people have been texting me back and forth. I'm grateful for what all these attorneys did today, and you know, they my friends, you know, because they did a hell of a job. And after just watching what happened to Kim Potter, I was like, I'm still gonna believe and I have faith, because I just wanted some time to be served from somebody for what happened to my brother. This is just accountability. It can never be justice, because I can never get George back. And no matter how many times that I pray at night and I think about my brother 24/7, it still is going to be hard, even though we just had a federal conviction and we already had the state conviction. But times, will be probably a lot harder for me still because I can't get my brother back. And at the same time, I hope that Congress, the Senate, whoever it is, they're looking at what's going on, because if people are being transparent and they're also speaking out and the jury said guilty, 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 then up there in Congress, they ought to go ahead and say, let's pass this George Floyd Justice Policing Act to be able to help people of color be able to understand that they can move around and understand that they won't be murdered on sight. We need to end the qualified immunity. We need to end the no-knock warrants. We need to make sure there's no more chokeholds and make sure all these police officers have their gear on, dash gear, body gear, all of it. Also, we need to start a registry for these officers to make sure that they can't leave from Minneapolis to get to Wisconsin and get a job there after you do something bad. So this is unfortunately a bad time, but it's also a good time. Like I said earlier, you come to some places and they might be wrong, but you're there for the right reasons. You know what I mean? So I just thank everybody who helped us out with this case, and I don't know how to act right now because I'm getting emotional. I got a lot of stuff going through my head. This has been a journey, and this has been over 2 years of the same stuff back and forth, back and forth. But I just thank everybody for coming out. I'm going to thank these lawyers so much because, without them, we wouldn't even be able to stand at this podium right now just to be able to speak about what happened. So, Benjamin Crump, I'd like to give him some credit. I'd like to give Keith Ellison some credit. Just so many people who had their hands in this case, and they just made it better for people. And I'm starting to feel like I can breathe again, but I just need you all to tell Congress to please read this. Don't let this tragedy hit your front door before you make a decision. Pass the law. Pass the George Floyd Policing Act. Thank y'all.
I'm Brandon Williams, the nephew of George Floyd. I'd like to start by saying God is good. And I want to send a huge thank you to everybody that's standing back here. Throughout the trial, they constantly checked on us and made sure that we were okay. And a special thanks to Miss Selena.
Miss Selena.
You were great, and we appreciate everything. She made it a lot easier for us to be here because, we've been here so many times since May 25th of 2020, and these visitors aren't happy. And, she did everything, and she was so great to comfort us and make this a lot easier because it's hard. It's a lot of sleepless nights. It's a lot of sad nights, holidays, birthdays, and you just wish George was here because, he was so family-oriented, and we miss him a lot. And, it's even worse because he was murdered. He didn't die of natural causes, and he should still be here. This day is historic because just not too long ago, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, were sentenced, found guilty in federal hate crimes as well. That's like 2 in the same week or maybe the same month. I don't know the exact date. And, that's historic for this country because oftentimes, officers kill black and brown men and women, and we get little to no consequences. A lot of times we don't even get charges, let alone a conviction. So we'll take this small victory, and smile about it and be happy, but deep down we're still hurting. We want this to stop. This means so much to us because we've connected with so many families, that's in similar situations and receive no justice. And, I'm shaking because my first trip here, the first press conference I did, I said that we're only coming here to get some justice and accountability. And today was another step towards that. And it feels good. We were very optimistic today, and when they said that the verdict, that the jury were deliberating because we saw what happened in the Kim Powder sentencing. There's no way that an unarmed black man supposedly accidentally killed, and the cop is only sentenced to 18 months. You know, I found that very disrespectful and hurtful because, you know, I've connected with Dante Wright's family, and I just felt for him so bad because I know what Dante meant to Miss Katie and Mr. Aubrey. So we were very optimistic and nervous pending the outcome of this verdict. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction for people that's in power to do the right thing, you know, to change laws and policies, you know, that's going to protect people from these situations. You know, and more than anything, that's going to hold them accountable and sends a message that says if you murder or use excessive or deadly force, it's consequences that follow.
Yes.
I think when you make a statement by convicting these officers, you know, they start to feel like, hey, maybe I shouldn't do it. I can't get away with it. Because in the past, they've gotten away with it so much. So all in all, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody that played a role in this. You know, thank you to family, friends, the people that don't know us, the media, everybody that got out and protested, that just sent prayers. You know, we really appreciate it because when these cameras go away, our pain don't. So thank y'all.
Yeah. And also, if they can make federal laws to protect the bird, then they can make federal laws to protect people of color. Thank you.
That's a press conference at the federal courthouse led by that man, the acting U.S. Attorney General, and then we heard several other folks talking. We're going to go ahead and break away from that, get a little bit of context on this, and then proceed with a little bit of the 5 o'clock news.
Let's go to Joe Tamburino once again. Joe, you heard the U.S. Attorney, well, interim U.S. Attorney speaking and all the other George Floyd's brother and nephew speaking. What do you make of what was said?
Or what stands out to you, Joe?
Yeah.
Well, what the federal authorities have stated, because we must remember this. This is going to create federal precedent, which will apply to all 50 states. There are approximately 94 federal districts throughout the country, and this is going to apply to all of them. Other districts will look at this case, will look at the solid conviction, and might do the same things on a whole variety of police officer conduct cases. So this will have great impact across the nation.
Joe, we appreciate it. Esme standing by the federal courthouse. Esme, I kind of go back to something you said earlier. You know, these 8 women and 4 men might just have applied this rule that was in the jury instructions that said, use some common sense.
Right, they absolutely did. And I'm going to step away here, and I don't know if our photojournalists can get a shot of the family members of George Floyd hugging the prosecution team. That's Philonise Floyd, brother of George Floyd, and also nephew of George Floyd, Brandon Williams. And really some very poignant, articulate statements coming from the Floyd family. And in the end, they said, you know, Brandon Williams said, I wish he could be here. He should still be here. And I think that is what they feel. But it is also a point that this verdict was historic, as Philonise Floyd said. So the Floyd family realizing that their brother, their loved one, is no longer here, but he really has changed policing in America and society in general with this verdict.
Yeah, and you know, we knew those changes were coming, Esme, but I think you're right. I think today's verdict really will cement that, not only because of the guilty on all 5 counts, but explain to people what this judge asked, this question that he asked all the jurors after, that they each individually had to answer.
Yeah. So if right after any of the guilty verdicts, if the jury found a guilty verdict on any count, the judge asked the jury to decide yes or no, did that deprivation of rights lead to George Floyd's death? And in every count, the jury answered yes. And that's significant because they're saying they may not have had the knee to the neck, but they contributed. They were part of the murder. They were right there contributing to the murder. And I think that that's something that is going to be a message for all police officers. And an interesting note, Frank, I did just hear from Attorney General Keith Ellison, who led the successful prosecution against Kim Potter, and also Derek Chauvin. He said that he is going to evaluate, he's not sure, about the second trial that is for these three officers that's supposed to occur in state court in June. He's looking at that. The Attorney General expected to make an announcement here very shortly. I don't know if he's going to get into a final announcement on that, but obviously that second trial, that state trial in June, is being evaluated.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
Understood. Yeah,
Yeah.
Esme, thanks for a breaking update. We appreciate it.
All right, well, Chris is here for a quick look at weather.
Yeah, it's snowing out there, obviously, and it's causing problems out on the roads. The commute's a rough one. You can see the snow is coming down, and the amounts are stacking up in some areas. We knew there'd be 1 to 2 inches, and that's pretty much what we're seeing from our WCCO Weather Watcher Network members. From Faribault to Savage, 1.5 to 1.7 inches of snow. It's very light. This is not going to crank out 5.1 inches like we had just a couple days ago, but you can see all of the slowdowns across the metro. Sometimes that's a good thing. People taking it easy, and hopefully folks have their headlights on. But if you're heading out over the next couple of hours, do know this light snow will be persistent, and it's certainly creating many slick spots out on the roadways out there. So do be careful. We've been watching some heavier bands falling across southeastern Minnesota. That's where we'll see the higher totals, but even there, maybe 2 to 3 inches in a few areas, as that is pushing deeper into Wisconsin at this point. And you can see this is the back edge right here around the Twin Cities. So we'll stay in the light snow for a while, and we're missing out on the heavy stuff that once again is pushing off to the southeast of us. Visibility is a big problem, of course, and it's getting worse now that the sun will be setting soon. It's down to a mile here in the Twin Cities, down to 1.25 miles in Mankato. We like to see it like northern Minnesota. You've had a very pleasant day today. A little cool, clearly, but no snow for you folks and ideal visibility. It's 11 degrees out there right now. A